Yeah, I'd sooner not, but we kind of have to. Let's talk about the Assyrians. The Assyrian Empire was a mighty empire from the Mesopotamia region. It has this huge reign from about the 21st century BC to about the 7th century BC. But where did the Assyrians come from? Well, in the final days of the Sumerian Empire, things were kind of falling apart piece by piece. And one of the great cities of the Sumerian Empire was a city named Ashur. Ashur is where we get the name Assyrian. And this city-state saw it upon itself to rebuild the great glory of the Sumerian Empire. In fact, the Assyrians used to love looking at the great ruins of the Sumerian Empire and telling a story about how a great flood came through and wiped out the Sumerian Empire. And they saw it as incumbent upon themselves to rebuild this empire by being great, strong, and above all else, using advanced technology. The two main cities of this empire became Ashur and Nineveh. The Assyrians start to come into their own after the Bronze Age collapse. The great empires like the Egyptians, Babylonians, and Hittites had started to go into pretty massive decline, if not disappear, and the Assyrians found themselves in a dog-eat-dog world. Groups like the Amorites and the Moabites were quickly rising up in prominence, and there was a desire that if you were not taking, you were going to be taken. You are either going to be on the attack or you're going to be on the defensive. So the Assyrians decided they are going to go full force attack. And out of this culture develops the mighty Assyrians, a fierce, powerful, warlike culture that loves to tear people apart and steal and own everything that they have. They conquer areas of Phoenicia, obviously Israel, and even Babylon itself, making them the greatest, mightiest empire in the world at that time. Now, there were three reasons why the Assyrians rose to power so quickly. Number one, iron. The Assyrians were one of the first groups to really turn up their iron smelting capacity. This is around the time when the world transitions from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age. Bronze is very rare, but if you find it, it melts at very low temperatures and is very easy to mold. Iron is very abundant, but it takes a tremendous heat in order to melt it so that it can be put into a weapon or whatever you use it for. The Assyrians probably learned from the Hittites how to smelt iron and decided to go full force into creating the first iron-based military, allowing them to crush the puny bronze weapons other groups around them were using. Reason number two, the Assyrians claimed to have an unbroken monarchy. The Abbasid dynasty had lasted well over 1,000 years. Whether or not it really was an unbroken dynasty, we don't really know, but we know the Assyrians claimed it was. And after the Bronze Age collapsed, most political dynasties lay in absolute ruin, and most of the kings that everyone knew about had long since been deposed. Assyria was seen as great because of its mighty dynastic power. In particular, the monarch Tiglath-Pileser III really emphasized his mighty monarchical dynasty. If one family could show they had the will and the power and the wisdom to maintain a monarchical dynasty for a millennia, it showed that they really had great capacity. This was particularly important in a post-Bronze Age collapse world where new empires were rising up and bandits and sea people and disorder was absolutely everywhere. The concept of a strong monarchy brought stability that people really desired. We see this in the biblical story where the Israelites cry out to have a king like the other nations. Because monarchy means stability, stability means safety, and safety means peace. Third, Assyria had a strong law code. When I say strong, I mean like bloody, like horrible, vicious, like kind of upsetting and just gross. People getting limbs chopped off and executed and tortured for really the slightest infraction. But yet, law code they did have, and they pursued it ruthlessly. If you broke the law, they were going to catch you. And as crazy as it might sound, if you live in a world that's full of bandits and it's full of disorder and people robbing each other and raping and pillaging at will, a strong law code kind of sounds nice if you're one of those people who want to obey the law. So there were a lot of people very attracted to the might and stability and power of the Assyrian Empire. It really helped them stand out as a mighty force within the post-Bronze Age. Bronze Age collapse world. Fortunately, we really know a lot about the Assyrians. This is largely due to a great library in Nineveh built by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal. Ashurbanipal collected a huge amount of clay tablets and brought them together within a library at Nineveh. Now, most of the clay tablets that we had in the world actually melted over time, but because of a great war and the Babylonians coming in and trying to burn down the Nineveh library, it actually baked the tablets to be even stronger so that they still exist today. Our oldest copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh actually comes from the library at Nineveh, and it was cooked extra crispy so we can still read it today. Sometimes war saves artifacts.
War. It's fantastic.
Now, if we're gonna talk about Assyrians, we just have to say they were the worst. They were really, really awful, horrible people. They were brutal, they were violent, they loved to go to war, they loved to, like, you know, kill people, wipe people out, torture people. It was kind of their thing. They were the first country to develop an industrial military complex. Previous empires knew they had to invest in war, but they almost saw it as wasted money because it just kind of defended you and, you know, they didn't make crops or do industry or things like that. But the Assyrians loved investing in the military. They took pride in investing in their military. Ideas like support the troops and big spending on national defense were very much Assyrian ideas. Assyrians saw their greatness and their identity being part of the strength of their military. This helped them to create the world's first military superpower. Not only was it great because it used iron weapons in a way others weren't using them, but also was innovative in its military approach. One example of this was the Assyrians were able to make the one-man chariots. Other chariots required a rider and a shooter, but the Assyrians developed a special kind of chariot where one could kind of have their chariot on autopilot or work it with one hand, while another place to put your bow where you could be firing arrows with the other hand. An incredibly skilled, detailed process that gave them an incredible military advantage in all of their battles. Assyrians saw themselves as being on the forefront of modern technology, particularly military technology. And as the Assyrians tore through battle after battle, conquering nation after nation, they accumulated an incredible amount of wealth. And with all this money, the Assyrians launched a mighty campaign of public works. This includes the incredible library at Nineveh and as many as 34 religious temples in the city of Ashur alone. The Assyrians had a very interesting, if not kind of upsetting, way of keeping the peace. When they would conquer a new country, they would take a bunch of people from that country, move them to a different country that they'd conquered, then take another group of people from another section that they had conquered and mix them in this new country. So you would have like 2 or 3 different groups living together within a city that the Assyrians conquered. The Assyrians understood that people are like really good at being racist. With all of this division, the two groups in the cities would kind of pick on each other more than like band together and actually present a real threat to the Assyrian army. They used racism as a weapon, as they understood a divided community was a weak community. Isn't it great politicians no longer use racial division as a weapon? A great example of this would be the Samaritans.
The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Seraphim and settled them in the towns of Samaria to replace the Israelites. They took over Samaria and lived in the towns. They worshipped the Lord, but they also served their own gods in accordance with the customs of the nations from which they have been brought. To this day they persist in their former practices, neither worship the Lord nor adhere to his decrees and regulations. The law, the commands of the Lord gave the descendants of Jacob, whom he named Israel.
From reading the New Testament, you could kind of see that most of the Israelites really hated the Samaritans. This is because the Assyrians had actually brought in other racial groups to Israel who had intermarried with them and sort of syncretized their religious ideas. And this ethnic mixing had created division within Israelite society that still was about 600 years later in Jesus' day. Assyrians were masters at racial division in order to contain power. Finally, the focus of Assyrian society was strength. Strength was the highest virtue an Assyrian could attain. When someone was dying and their body was starting to fail, the Assyrian believed it was because Ishtar was actually sucking out the strength of that person in order to bring it to the underworld to create sort of a new, stronger, more powerful body for them. So if you had a particularly long, lengthy, gruesome death, it just kind of meant you were extra strong and they were going to build a super cool body for you in the afterlife. The primary primary god of the Assyrians was the god Ashur. Ashur was actually the son of Enlil, but Ashur defeats Enlil in combat and enables himself to be the mightiest of the gods and take his own mother as his wife in a show of strength. Assyrians thought that was great because if you could defeat somebody, you were the coolest, even if it was your own father. Assyrians were known for their particularly brutal treatment of prisoners of war. When Assyrians were about to invade a new place, they might bring out some of the prisoners of war and torture them in front of the army they were facing in order to show their viciousness and their strength. It wouldn't be uncommon for them to bring forth a prisoner of war and cut off their ears or their nose, or actually skin them alive in front of an army they were about to face to show the Assyrians were mighty. This was particularly in line with our favorite pagan goddess, Ishtar.
I found the spirit of Ishtar.
Ishtar pops up again and again with Sumerians and Babylonians. They just really like, a goddess of sex and violence. I guess she was just very powerful. Assyrians used fear and cruelty as a weapon, and their vicious gods only encouraged this.
I will cut their throats like lambs. I will cut off their precious lives as one cuts a string. Like the waters of a storm, I made the contents of their gullets and entrails run down upon the wide earth. My prancing steed, harness for my riding, plunged into the streams of blood as into a river. The wheels of my war chariot, which brings low the wicked and the evil, were besmattered with blood and filth. With their bodies of their warriors I filled the plain like grass. Their testicles I cut off and tore out their privates like the seeds of a cucumber.
Let's talk about the Assyrians in the Bible. Famously, the prophet Jonah is asked to go to Nineveh to preach to the people there. After understanding the viciousness and the cruelty and horribleness of the Assyrians, it kind of makes a lot of sense why Jonah did not want to go there. But what the Assyrians are most famous for is the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel. In 721 BC, Assyria comes in and destroys Israel. Like the other invasion, this one's complicated and it's got a lot of messiness in it, but let's do our best. Unlike Judah, the kings of Israel were not from one political dynasty, but kind of a mishmash of overthrows and assassinations and political deception. It's very hard to keep hold of it. So King Menahem was paying tribute to the king of Assyria in hopes that the king of Assyria would kind of hook him up so that he could conquer all of Israel and be the king of Israel. When this succeeds, Menahem is succeeded by his son, Pekahiah. But Pekahiah is assassinated while he's on the throne, probably from an anti-Assyrian party within his own country, and he is succeeded by Pekah. So Pekah's probably from an anti-Assyrian party within Israel, and he decides to form an alliance. He collaborates with the kingdoms of Aram and probably the Moabites and Edomites. Now you've got this confederation of Israelites and Aramites and Edomites and Moabites who have come together in one mighty anti-Assyrian alliance. And then Pekah from Israel heads down to Judah to try and ask the Judah king Ahaz, do you want to join our anti-Assyrian alliance? We are so strong, bro. We are ready to kick butt and take names. We're going to take down the Assyrians. We'll be totally free. It'll be legit. You should definitely come join our side. To which Ahaz responds, you know what, bro? I'm kind of cool. Maybe this isn't going to go down so hot for us. So I'm going to sit this one out, but good luck to you guys. Well then, Pekah, king of Israel, gets super mad at Ahaz, and Pekah, Israel, actually invades Judah, starts to destroy some towns, and actually takes some Judites prisoner up to Israel. So then Ahaz is kind of freaking out. And Ahaz writes to Assyria to ask for help. Hey, Assyrian king Sennacherib, there's a pretty nasty anti-Assyrian alliance that's happening over there with all my neighbors, and I don't even want to join it because I think you're super cool. I am down with the Assyrians, so here, can I give you some money and you can come and defeat this anti-Assyrian alliance for me? That'd be super cool, thank you. And then the Assyrian king Sennacherib comes in and wipes out the entire country of Israel. From henceforth, the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel would be lost to history. You may have actually heard stories that those 10 tribes went off and formed Norway or England or various other number of countries. Unfortunately, these theories are completely ahistorical and are usually tied to a nasty form of racism. The reality is the 10 tribes were split up. The tribes would have been split into multiple pieces and put in various parts all over the Assyrian Empire and just assimilated into their culture. And as terrible as this was, unfortunately, that is not where the story ends. After destroying Israel, the Assyrian king Sennacherib decides he wants to take over Judah as well, and the Assyrians invade the peaceful Judean city of Lachish. We have really horrible images from that time of people being ripped in two and the Assyrians coming in with siege ramps and slingshots and absolutely annihilating this peaceful city. The Assyrian troops attempt to take over Judah and wipe it out. And the next thing that happens is one of the great interesting mysteries of all of history. Sennacherib stands outside of Jerusalem, ready to conquer this city from the king Hezekiah. But for some reason, he fails to capture the city. And we have 3 accounts of this battle that we're going to look into today. In Isaiah 37, we read that King Hezekiah turns to the Lord and prays for protection.
Then the angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 in the Assyrian camp. When the people got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, broke camp and withdrew. He returned to Nineveh and stayed there.
From this prayer, an angel of the Lord comes down and destroys the Assyrian army. The next account of the battle is actually from Sennacherib's prison. Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, wrote great details of his exploits and put them on these beautiful prisms, which still exist today. Within Sennacherib's prison, he says that he caged Hezekiah like a bird. You very much get an idea of Hezekiah being defeated, although it's never explicitly said. When it said Hezekiah was caged like a bird, you got the idea of them cutting off all of the supplies into Jerusalem. Now, usually when a city was surrounded, it meant death for the city, cutting them off from food and water supplies. But interestingly, archaeologists have actually discovered that there was a Hezekiah's tunnel underneath the city, which let them get fresh water within the city so they could withstand a siege. This tunnel shows that Hezekiah and the Judeans would have been able to be safe inside Jerusalem for a very long time, even with the Assyrian army cutting them off from the outside. It appears that Hezekiah was able to outlast the Assyrian siege. And although the Assyrians probably intended to destroy Jerusalem, it is almost certain that they failed to do so. So we've got 2 accounts here. We've got the biblical account, which says an angel of the Lord comes down and destroys the Assyrian army. We've got the Assyrian account, which says that they caged in the people, but for some reason leave and say they got a big tribute for doing so, which is very strange as the Assyrians probably went there to destroy Jerusalem. So what's the truth? This brings us to our 3rd account from the Greek historian Herodotus. Herodotus looked at Egyptian sources, and it says that Egyptians actually sided with Judah and tried to give them some protection at this time. Herodotus said there was actually a massive outbreak of rats and mice that sort of sneak into the Assyrian camps at this time. Herodotus actually tells us that the Assyrian army were so besieged by these mice and rats that it tore up their ropes and other equipment that they have, leaving them unable for battle. Also, rats have a lot of bubonic plague and nastiness on them, and they'll destroy your food sources pretty quick. They probably left the Assyrian army quite decimated. So King Sennacherib, looking at his troops that had, no real equipment, very low food supplies, and a bunch of them being really, really sick, said, this is not a good time for me to invade a very highly fortified city. Sennacherib probably sues for peace for a very modest payout, goes back to Assyria, and leaves Jerusalem standing. The destruction of Israel has a devastating effect upon the psyche of the followers of God. Even though Israel had been rejecting God in many ways, the destruction of the people group was shocking to those around them. Many of the prophets of the Old Testament would tell stories about this destruction and life after its destruction.
The shields of the soldiers are red, the warriors are clad in scarlet, the metal on the chariot flashes on the day they are made ready, the spears of juniper are brandished, the chariots storm through the streets, rushing back and forth through the squares, they look like flaming torches, they dart about like lightning.
The power of Assyria rocked even the people of God and their prophets with how severe the judgment was that came from God and other nations.